Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Joining me tonight on this Monday night, it's been a little bit, co-host Will Miles. You can find him at Will Miles SEC on Twitter. His site, Read and Reaction, readandreaction.com, and on YouTube at Read and Reaction as well. Will, since we have gotten together, some talks of Florida and looking ahead to the 23 season, coming out of spring practice, of course, everybody's had their spring games now. So, of course, not long after that, we'll probably get some updated projections, updated rankings, and we certainly got him here through DraftKings and their Vegas thoughts of Florida's win total, but also the ever so popular ESPN FPI.
Yeah, man. Hey, it's nice to see football's just around the corner. We all get to have a good time this summer, and by the time we get back, it'll be time for Utah. So it's nice to be coming out of spring practice, a little bit of certainty about what's going to happen. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, depending upon what position we're talking about. But football's on the horizon. That's always a fun time. August, the last week in August, first week in September is like my Christmas, man. So when that kicks off, it's like, all right, let's go get this done. So looking forward to it, and hopefully Florida can outperform some of the projections we're going to be talking about tonight.
Absolutely. Hey, we'll talk some recruiting as well. Kind of busy time right now. Commit late last Friday, of course, late last week. So I had an episode about that, but we'll get into it just a bit, just in case you missed that episode. And Will and I together for the first time since that commitment of Isaiah Williams, the wide receivers. And also just some recruiting news. A lot of visits happening for the Gators over the weekend and some recruiting news as well. So everybody hit that like button, hit that subscribe button before we get into this episode of Gators Breakdown. Those likes and subscribes go a long way in support. You can also support us at Gators Breakdown Plus. The link is in the description there to join. You get the Discord server, the conversation going on there all the time, ad-free episodes on the podcast version. And one more time, of course, don't forget the Florida Victorious $2 million match challenge for the month of May. Every new pledge, one-time pledges as well, and membership signups will be matched up to a total of $2 million. Let's make 2 million, 4 million, double the impact this month. Link is in the description to join Florida Victorious. So, well, let's get into it. And this was last week, and really, maybe shocking to some Gator fans, maybe a realization for some Gator fans. Some not surprised. Some a lot of people did agree with this, but DraftKings put out their season win totals last week, and we'll just stay with the SEC for now, of course, because it's where Florida resides, and you have to go pretty much all the way to the bottom, Will, before you find Florida and their win total only higher than Vanderbilt. When you look at the SEC 2023 win totals by DraftKings, no surprise at the top here at the SEC. Georgia, 11.5. That's what the over-under is for Georgia. Alabama, 10.5. Tennessee and LSU both at 9.5. Then a group of 7.5. Ole Miss, Arkansas, Texas A&M, all sit at 7.5 for their over-under win totals here. Then a big group of 6.5 of over-under. South Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri, Mississippi State, and Auburn, all at 6.5. One game better than Florida, sitting at 5.5 for their over-under win total. And then Vanderbilt bringing it up in the SEC at 3.5. Will, your initial reaction to seeing Florida and their 5.5 over-under win total from DraftKings?
My initial reaction is that those last two games of the year really color people's opinions. The way the season finished, I think, colors people's opinions. Because anybody who saw the South Carolina-Florida game last year wouldn't necessarily be like, "Oh yeah, South Carolina-Florida, right on." Like you would have the over/under for those teams like dead even. Same thing. Kentucky game was close. Missouri's been worse than Florida for the last 3 or 4 years. The other thing is when you look at this from an over/under perspective, all the SEC East teams are in the right-hand column other than Georgia and Tennessee, which means there's a lot of variance here, right? I mean, Florida's being picked at 5.5. That's where the money's going, right? People were banging the under if it had come in coming a little bit higher than that. And so you put it in a place where you want people to make the bet. So
there you go. That's what you have to remember. This is about making money for Vegas. So this line is, they want to see a lot of people at 6. They want to see a lot of people at 5, and we'll see where it goes as we get closer to the season.
Yeah, well, and let's see where the number goes, right? Yeah. Because if the number goes to 6, or if the number creeps up to 6.5, then that says that people think they're getting value at Florida at 5.5. And I think that's maybe the first thing I think of when I see this. Is I go from a gambling perspective, 5.5 for Florida, just based on past history, is a value pick, because even poor Florida teams tend to go like 7 and 5. And so, we've had a couple of 6 and 7 seasons, and those have been bad. So you've already reached the over under in those seasons. And the idea that you'd be able to do it again, hey, I see that. And look, there's the powerhouse of Georgia in the East. Tennessee, everybody's picking, but they got a lot that they got to replace too. And it turns out when your quarterback leaves, that usually has an impact on things. And other than that, it's all SEC West sitting over there in the higher over-under category, which really means Florida's going to have an opportunity. Are they better than Vanderbilt? Yeah, but they didn't show it last year. Are they better than Missouri? Yeah. Are they better than Kentucky? They should be. And then South Carolina, it's all going to depend on how Spencer Rattler plays. So, look, I think you can go through Florida's schedule, and a lot of their games are sort of toss-ups. And the question you have to ask is,
we'll do that.
Development and all that sort of stuff going to allow those toss-up games to be 500? Is it going to be, 4-1 in Florida's advantage, or 1-4 to Florida's detriment? And that'll sort of determine where this number ends up. But 5.5, my first indication, that's reasonable. That's pretty low compared to what I would have thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think I would have went 6.5, and then seeing Auburn at 6.5 and new coach Hugh Freeze, they're awful for the last couple of years as well. Seeing Auburn at 6.5 and Florida 5.5, that's probably my first reservation. I was like, okay, you might can sell me 5.5 on Florida. I won't fight you too much on that. But then to see Auburn at 6.5, I'm like, nah, okay. I mean, I get it. I get it. Florida's schedule is going to come into play a bit too. We'll get into that in just a second. Your out-of-conference opponents being Utah, being FSU, you total that into an SEC schedule, and of course it's going to probably affect that win total that Vegas is going to throw out there right now. But yeah, I have a hard time accepting the fact that they have Auburn at 6.5, Florida 5.5. And look, Texas A&M was awful last year, underachieved like crazy, and 2 games better than Florida with an SEC West schedule to go along with that. And it's just those are probably the ones that stand out a bit the most to me. Missouri 6.5 too, probably as well. I know they've recruited better than they have in kind of their history. A really good recruiting class 2 cycles ago that they maybe be benefit now in this year, so that gets them up to 6.5. But I think maybe seeing Auburn, Missouri at 6.5. A&M 2 games better at 7.5, and I know they've recruited really well. That has probably a lot to do with that. But then being in the SEC West and maybe those 2 games better than where Florida sits right now, that's where if I would have saw Florida at 6.5, I don't think I would have batted an eye. I would have been total agreement with it. But seeing Florida at 5.5, and where they have some other teams, that's probably where I do have a little bit of reservation.
Yeah, I mean, I think Arkansas is the one that jumps out at me. Arkansas, when you look at the defensive performance, they were down there with Florida and Vanderbilt in terms of the worst defenses last year. KJ Jefferson at quarterback, so I understand why they've got them higher. But again, who are they facing? Right? I mean, look at the teams that they have to face who are sitting in front of them. You figure that's going to drive that down. But again, if you're going to put a bet on somebody for over, you're going to pick a guy with a proven quarterback. That's why Missouri is shocking, because Brady Cook, I mean, geez, he's like Graham Mertz light. They're in Missouri. I don't think that we're like, I'm not looking at it going, oh, Brady Cook's going to win Missouri a bunch of games. Same thing. Levis leaves Kentucky. Now, I actually think Kentucky's probably going to be better just by subtraction for Will Levis, sort of like Bill Simmons Ewing theory type of thing going on there, because I'm not a Will Levis fan. But yeah, I mean, look, the SEC last year was Georgia, Alabama, kind of Tennessee, and then a whole grouping of teams. LSU got fortunate in some one-score games. Florida not so fortunate in one-score games, and that was sort of the differentiation between all of those teams that were in the middle. So you're looking at this between 5.5 and 7.5. It's 3/4 of the conference, and it's all those teams that were sort of grouped in the middle. So that's going to be the question, right? Is where can Florida make gains where they were bad last year, where they're going to be average this year, or where they're able to maybe take a gain from where they were average to where they're good? And then how do they minimize the reductions in terms of their overall production? And that's one of the good things, is that Florida was really effective between the 20s, but was really bad in the red zones on offense. And so they don't have to necessarily be as good on offense to put up the exact same numbers. And the defense was so bad that they're going to improve somewhat regardless of what happens. They can't be as bad as they were last year. I just don't think it's possible. And so that right there makes me say you go over 5.5, just because I think the offense is going to be able to be as good as it was last year, at least in terms of points. I think they'll be less effective. I think it'll be less fun to watch, but I think from a point perspective, they'll probably be pretty close to what they had last year. And then the defense is not just going to be Swiss cheese. It might be against Georgia, might be against Tennessee, but when you get in those games against Missouri and Kentucky and South Carolina, we'll be in for some rock fights, and Florida's just going to have to come out on top of a couple of those. And all of a sudden you'll be looking at, 6, 7, or 8 wins.
Yeah, so 5.5 there in Vegas by DraftKings, of course. We'll look at maybe at some point look at some other books and see what they have there. I think you'll see Florida around that 5.5, 6.5 for most books out there. But one reason to feel a little bit better, this is the up and down part of this and goes into it. So 5.5, the win total by Vegas. Well, Will, if you go to ESPN and their FPI and their predictor, well, they feel a little bit better about Florida. They're telling you if you go to Vegas, you better be hitting the over, is what the ESPN FPI is saying. They give Florida an 82.2% chance, Will, to win 6 games. Now, I went and dived into the FPI, and that is one column there is their chance to win 6 games. Every team's chance to win 6 games. And with Florida sitting at 5.5, ESPN says, okay, go with it. You got an 82% chance of beating that 5.5 there in Vegas. So one more time, ESPN FPI gives Florida an 82.2% chance to win 6 games. And you see it right here. ESPN, the FPI, well, they got Florida ranked 18th. You look at top 25 rankings, and college football preseason magazines will be coming out. We've seen all the kind of post-spring, after the national championship game as well. And no surprise to us, Florida is nowhere to be found in top 25 rankings right now. But one out there, the FPI, now don't get me wrong, this is not, one of the best metrics out there. We've had our quarrels with the FPI before, and it does some good, they do some bad. They're kind of all over the place sometimes, but it is one metric to go by out there, and one right now, Will, that has Florida 18th.
Yeah, well, look, I think the question is, so Florida doesn't have a talent deficit to most of the teams they're going to play this year.
Correct.
When it comes to Georgia, yeah, they got a talent deficit. When it comes to LSU, they have a talent deficit. This team's more talented than Florida State, more talented than South Carolina, Arkansas, Missouri, Vanderbilt, Kentucky, Charlotte, Tennessee, McNeese, and I think even Utah. Now, it's a lot of young talent, and so I think that's the thing, is when you look at Phil Steele's magazines, he tends to look at both the talent level that they have, but then also the number of returning players that they have, and sort of formulates that into a win total. So that's going to be the question, is how does this team coalesce? But look, last year you had a talented team, but you had guys getting kicked off the team in the middle of the year. You had a defense that just couldn't stop anybody. I'm kind of amazed there weren't more finger pointing that was going on. You had a quarterback who was up and down every single game. So, and that team still managed to go 6-7. Now look, was it perfect? No, they went 1-4 in 1-score games though. You turn that around and go 2-3 or 3-2, and all of a sudden you're looking at a 7 or 8 win team. I think the baseline here is sort of 5, right? You look at McNeese, Charlotte, and Vanderbilt. The FPI has it at 90+% for all 3 of those. So if you say I'm 3-0 in those, then they got a bunch that are toss-ups, right? Tennessee, Florida State, Missouri, Arkansas is at 66, so they think the Gators are going to beat them, and then South Carolina 58. So a few toss-ups there, a couple where Florida should be favored pretty heavily. Maybe you drop one of those, but even if you drop one of those and then drop the rest of the ones where you're not favored, you're sitting at 7-5. So I think 5.5 is a gift for people who want to gamble. I will go put money on that on on FanDuel if they have it on there after the podcast.
There we go. So let's go through it, Will. The ESPN FPI and the percentage of Florida wins here. At Utah, they give Florida a 29.7% chance to go to Utah and win that game, basically 30% chance for Florida to go to Salt Lake and win that game there.
I got a question for you. Is Rising going to play?
That is the big question. And coming off that injury in a bowl game again for the second year in a row. And I don't think there's a clear answer to that, Will. I think they're probably optimistic he plays. But yeah, I mean, any kind of setback in fall camp, and you're asking yourself that question. So maybe if you can go find an early line on Florida, Utah right now in Vegas, you might want to go take it.
Well, because right now, Utah versus Florida Rising versus Mertz, I go, okay, that's advantage Utah.
Yeah.
But if it's random Utah quarterback who's been terrible when Rising's gone out for the last 2 years versus Mertz, well, now, look, that Wisconsin offense looks terrible, but, at least it's somebody who's got 30-something starts under his belt. So that's one to watch out for, because I think, this isn't something where Rising's going to have a full off season to work with his receivers and sort of, take a leap forward. This is going to be, is he able to maintain where he was at in his level of play last year? This isn't the first serious injury he's had. Maybe that's why it's at 29%. But, I just look at this and say Florida's a more talented team, except at the quarterback position. And so if there's no advantage at quarterback position, I think that one jumps up quite a bit.
Yeah. So with this, they go McNeese next, of course, 99% chance to win that game. And then maybe a bit of a surprise, because the game is at home, I would assume here, but Tennessee, they have Florida as percentage chance to win, 51.7, basically a toss-up right there. But you do get Florida with some favorable odds right there, according to the ESPN FPI. Charlotte, 96.3%. At Kentucky, 48.4, basically another toss-up right there as well. On the road at Kentucky, right there for Florida. Vanderbilt, 90.4, a team that beat Florida, as a big surprise last year. They don't beat Florida all too often, but they still, are not taking too much from that game last year, Will, and give Florida a 90% chance to beat Vanderbilt. And then at South Carolina, still Florida, I do think, and this is the ESPN FPI, I do think if you go to Vegas, Will, you would not find Florida. Of course, we just kind of went through it a bit here. You won't find Florida favored in a lot of these games here, but at South Carolina, the ESPN FPI has Florida 58.9, basically around 60% chance of beating South Carolina at South Carolina. And then, of course, the lowest one on the schedule, Georgia, give Florida a 13.8% chance to beat Georgia. And as you said, Will, you alluded to it earlier, the week after that, okay, you return home, beat, and they have Arkansas as a 66.2% chance for Florida to win that game. At LSU, 18.5% chance for Florida to win that game, says the ESPN FPI. And then favorable right here in the last two games of the season. At Missouri, they give Florida basically a 58% chance. And then Florida State, that game is at home for the Gators, 50.3, basically a toss-up right there. In the end, Will, if you look at ESPN's FPI for Florida, they have Florida at 6.8 wins, basically 7, and 5.2 losses. So basically they see Florida as a 7-5 team. But if you go here and if you look on the YouTube, you look at the orange, they have Florida 8. Favorable matchups here for the ESPN FPI. So 8-4 if you want to take it for this percentage of chance. But as we said, Florida State pretty much a toss-up. Tennessee pretty much a toss-up, according to the ESPN FPI.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the first 7 games, I can certainly see a scenario where they're 5-2 or 6-1.
Yeah.
Like, I can see that scenario. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but I can see it. So to have them at 5.5, again, I just think it's a little bit of a gift there. Look, they're going to struggle when it comes to Georgia and Arkansas, and Georgia and LSU, and maybe having Arkansas and Missouri on either side of that will make it even worse. I think everybody gives Florida State a lot of credit last year for a team that, quite honestly, was on the ropes against Florida in Tallahassee last year. And then Richardson sort of turned into bad Richardson in the second half, and all of a sudden things were tightening up there to the end. But I mean, they were a face mask call away or a dropped pass on a beautiful throw by Richardson there in the fourth quarter away from having that one slip through their fingers. So Florida isn't that far off. I mean, I think everybody looks at 6-6, and look, I'm somebody who's negative about the recruiting too over the last couple of years, but that's still top 10, top 15 recruiting classes. That's better than just about everybody on the schedule, say for Georgia and LSU. So you should be able to go compete with Kentucky. You should be able to go compete with Tennessee. You should be able to go compete with Florida State. And I think they're going to do that this year. I think the second year bump that you see in schools is a real thing, where you sort of weeded out the guys who didn't want to be a part of the program. The portal seems to make that a little bit easier these days to do that. Florida's certainly going with a youth movement, but I think that youth movement, we've already seen ETN and Shamar James and Kamari Wilson and those sorts of guys step forward. The question is going to be depth, right? And by the time you get to that Georgia, Arkansas, LSU stretch, are you a mash unit where you've got a bunch of guys out and your quarterback isn't able to get the ball down the field? Maybe you're even on a second quarterback at that point, depending upon what happens on the offensive line. Or have you been able to keep everything together? You've had good injury luck, and you come into that Georgia game feeling kind of good about yourself. Even if you get stomped, it doesn't kill your season because of what the expectations were coming in. So, hey, hold on to that 5.5, set that as your expectations, and then if what we think happens, you'll be pleased with the results, even if it's 7-5, because you thought was going to be 5-5 to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at toss-ups there, Will. Tennessee, they have as a toss-up pretty much. Kentucky, pretty much a toss-up. South Carolina, better than a toss-up, but, I think we kind of know that's a toss-up game for Florida when you're sitting there and look at it. Arkansas, so we got what? Tennessee, Kentucky, so that's 2. South Carolina, 3. Arkansas, 4. Missouri, 5. I mean, look, there's 5 games right there that will probably determine how we think about this Florida team. Games that are winnable, games – as far as recent history shows, Florida should be winning those games. And I say recent history as far as, once Florida became a contender, those are games Florida wins. And, you get back to that. As you said, you're a young team. Those are things Florida's got to figure out along the way. Got that young team going out on the road versus Utah in a very, very tough environment that they're going to be ready for on a Thursday night. But, there's other games where we pretty much call them toss-ups. I mean, you go 3-2 in those games, and okay, Florida's probably, as you said, I think beating that 5.5.
Well, I think you can even add Kentucky into that, right? FPI has that at 48.4. Yeah. It's at Kentucky, but again, no Levis. We'll see what that means. Kentucky has struggled when they haven't had quarterback play. They've been able to squeak out a couple of 10-win seasons. It's a good program, but it's nothing where, they haven't stomped Florida. There have been a couple of times where they've beaten the Gators recently, but that's been such a one-sided rivalry that I just look at it and say, I think that will eventually turn around. But again, you said, so if you've got Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, Missouri, and Florida State as toss-ups, and then you've got Arkansas, the must-win and Arkansas. But
I think Arkansas. I think that's a toss-up.
Well, so again, you go 3-3 there, and then you have McNeese, Charlotte, and Vanderbilt. You're at 6.
Yeah.
Right. So it's I will be surprised if Florida goes 6-7. I will be. I think Florida's going to be better this year. I think there's a lot to be said for. You could tell that Napier did not have confidence in his team in general last year because of the way he waffled and the way he changed the way he coached. Now, look, maybe I'll be wrong, and maybe he'll change. Maybe he'll waffle, and maybe he'll change the way he coaches in different games this year, and then I'll be incredibly critical about it. But the way he coached against Tennessee last year is, I think, the way he wants to coach. And if he does that and does that throughout the year, I think they're going to end up with a good record in one-score games. And the fact that you've got so many toss-ups means I think they probably come out ahead.
That's a good point, Will. I mean, how much does it change if he has a defense he trusts? Like, I do think the reason he coached in that Tennessee game the way he coached was because he didn't believe in that defense, so he was taking a little bit more chances. But no, that was kind of his MO too at Louisiana. And as you said, kind of for the season, he was a little more aggressive than probably other coaches out there in some of those fourth down calls, some of the even third down calls, knowing that he's going to go for it on fourth down. If a better defense does show up for Florida, how much does that change his aggression?
I mean, I thought he was aggressive against Kentucky, maybe even overly aggressive.
Yes,
I thought he was aggressive against Tennessee, and that was necessary in that game. And then I thought he went into a shell a little bit the second half of the year. I did not think he was as aggressive as the season wore on, and I think that actually might have cost him a game or two when he was doing it. But, again, I go back and I look at what he was dealing with, a really inconsistent quarterback who was turning the ball over, and then a defense that couldn't stop anybody, and go, if you're giving up 45 points to everybody, I'm not sure what you do. No matter what decision you make, it's not going to matter, because if you turn the ball over, then your defense just gives up a touchdown. And if you go and make it, it doesn't matter. The minute you kick the ball back to Tennessee, they're just going to go the other direction, score a touchdown anyway. So yes, having just solid play in those areas. I don't know that it needs to be outstanding play, solid play where you can get a 3-and-out, where it is possible to get a 3-and-out, where it is possible to get a third down stop, where he's not telling himself,
we can't stop him. Maybe he could actually ask himself, maybe maybe we can stop them. Maybe.
Well, I mean, it would be nice if we could stop Vanderbilt. How about that? Let's start with getting a third down stop and getting off the field against Vanderbilt. I actually think, it's funny. We're Nick and I are working on this preseason magazine. It's going to be coming out pretty soon, and we've been going through, or one of the things I've been writing this week is the just sort of summary on the defense, the defensive line, and the linebackers, and the safeties, and the cornerbacks. Oh, there it is, and I'm more encouraged going through that than I have been in a long time sort of looking at this. So, look, people know that I tend to be pretty critical when it comes to this sort of stuff. People even accuse me of being overly critical. But, as I'm going through this stuff and looking at the numbers and looking at the players and that sort of stuff, I have pretty high hopes for where this is going to go. Again, high hopes relative to a 5.5 over under.
Right.
But high hopes regardless, right? I think that's going to be an effective I think they're going to be better this year than people think.
Well, before we get into some recruiting, update us on that Read and Reaction preseason magazine.
Yeah, so you can still go pre-order right now. It's readandreaction.com/mag. That's readandreaction.com/MAG. We're giving it out in hard copy this year. If you want it hard copy, we had requests last year for that. You got a couple of days left, and then the price is going to go up. So May 10th is the last day to pre-order it at the existing price. That's because we're going to order them in bulk, and then afterwards we're going to have to order them in like groups of 10. It's more expensive to do that. So if you want it, go over there to readandreaction.com/mag. You can get a hard copy of the magazine. We're still going to have a digital copy like we did last year. So on Memorial Day, when it launches, you'll be able to go over there, order it. It'll show up right in your email box on Memorial Day. And then we'll probably have another run right around Father's Day, right before Father's Day. So if you miss this one, there will be an opportunity to get a little bit later as well for Father's Day. But, it's going to be 75 pages. Actually, I think we've zeroed in on 76 pages of Florida Gator only content. Like I said, we're doing analysis of the different positions. We've got all the stuff about recruiting that you could want in there. Nick did this really cool thing with maps where he looked at the distance of each recruit from for each of the different programs. So we always talk about drawing that circle around the state of Florida and what Billy Napier can do. And you can actually really see some really cool stuff when you look at Florida versus Georgia and South Carolina, some of the other programs and where they stand. And then I'm doing something new this year. We're going to have an entire section that are just film breakdowns. So it's a cool interactive feature where you'll be able to scan a QR code that'll take you to YouTube to the actual clip. And then we're diagramming the play and explaining exactly what was going on with Billy Napier. And then some with Austin Armstrong as well, when he was at Southern Miss, being able to understand what he's doing with his defense and things like that. So I think that's going to be a really cool feature that people are going to enjoy, so that you can sort of, talk to people about what's going on the field, hopefully once the season starts, because you will have already seen a lot of these concepts in the magazine.
There we go. Readandreaction.com/mag to get your Read and Reaction preseason magazine. So, all right, let's turn the page to recruiting, Will. And of course, probably the biggest headline over the weekend, I'd say Jeremiah Smith, number 1 receiver in the country, one of the top players in the country, said he was going to visit Florida. So, okay, maybe no huge surprise there. We figured a visit would happen there. Of course, committed to Ohio State right now, but was going to originally visit on June the 9th, and then almost as soon as that was announced, changed it to the weekend of June the 2nd. And that's the same weekend as DJ Lagway, quarterback commit for the Gators. Same weekend that he's visiting. So great to see those two back together. But Will, of course, big news for the top wide receiver in the country, one of the top players in the country as well. Now, look, I still think Ohio State, as of this moment, I think that would be the choice when he signs on signing day. But, need to chip away here, and visits are a way to do that. But I can't believe I saw over the weekend, I saw the notion that, this isn't a big deal. Getting him on campus isn't a big deal. There's no benefit. Why waste the time? Because he's going to Ohio State anyway. What? I mean, I can't believe. I mean, look, I think he's going to Ohio State when it's all said and done. But you know what? Just in case he doesn't, you have to put yourself in position to take advantage. Who knows what in today's college football? Who knows what's going to happen right now? Hartline could leave Ohio State. Ryan Day could leave Ohio State, go to the NFL, take Hartline with him. Maybe he doesn't become the head coach at Ohio State. But anything can happen. I'd say he still goes to Ohio State, but you put yourself in position. If something crazy happens at Ohio State, if something crazy happens at another school, you don't say, no, we're not going to let him visit because why waste the time? You never know, Will, in today's college football, what will happen down the road. Say Ryan Day leaves, after his freshman season and they bring a new staff in and he hits the transfer portal, he's still going to remember these visits he took to Florida and the relationship he may have built with DJ Lagway and Billy Napier and Billy Gonzalez in the coming weeks and the coming months. So, this notion of it doesn't, he's an Ohio State commit, he's not coming to Florida. It doesn't matter. If a top guy, if you want to host anybody, you as a coaching staff, you do it anyway. But one of the top players in the country, right now, people are labeling some of the best wide receiver play they've seen in quite some time. You let this kid visit whenever he wants to.
I mean, well said. I'm sitting here going, not trying is a loser mentality. And if you want to be a loser, quit trying.
Jim McElwain and Dan Mullen did not want to get in these big boy battles.
Well, and look, I mean, partly because they had people coming after him and saying, well, you're not going to do it anyway. Now, look, the other thing is that things have changed over the last 6 months in Gainesville. I think, you got that big Florida Victorious thing over there over your shoulder. That's a new development within Florida's ecosystem of recruiting. The Florida law, where they can now coordinate with some of the NIL organizations, is part of a new ecosystem that Florida is dealing with. Now, you can have an argument that maybe they should have ignored that anyway, but they didn't, right? And so they were at a disadvantage when it came to recruiting against some people, and that disadvantage has been closed. And so if Florida Victorious is doing its job, if Billy Napier and his staff are doing their job, then the ecosystem for the recruiting should have changed, which means that the timing where Jeremiah Smith made that decision to go to Ohio State has changed. And so since that's changed, you got to show them what's changed. And you just look, I mean, recruiting is constant, and it's a chip away at each of the different recruits. And look, maybe Jeremiah Smith decides not to come there, but maybe somebody who you can go and recruit and say, look, we had Jeremiah Smith in here. We like you better, and you're the 12th ranked wide receiver in the country or something like that. Or, hey, don't you want to come to a place where the number one wide receiver is coming and considering? Like, yeah, it's going to stink when you lose. And at some point, like, it stings when the number 2 player in the country decides not to flip to where you're at. But if you never try, like, I mean, it's one of those things. I've made the joke before that there are sales guys out there who must have gotten married to the first woman who asked them just because they never learned how to say no to a customer. Like, I think it's the same thing when it comes to recruiting. Like, you just have to ask and ask and ask and ask. And sometimes the pretty girl's going to say she wants to go with somebody else. But if you never ask, you're never going to have that person go with you to any of the dances. And so, look, you got to dance in recruiting when it comes to building a championship program. Having a guy on for an official visit, right? It's not an unofficial. He's not just randomly visiting. Maybe he and DJ Lagway become like best friends while he's here. They already seem to have a pretty tight relationship. All of a sudden, they become just like best friends and start talking about being able to play together, and that makes the decision a little bit more difficult. And he goes, you know what? Well, maybe if the NIL deal was a little bit sweeter, I would go ahead and make a change. And all of a sudden, now Ohio State feels a little bit offended because he's sort of asking for more than what the original deal was. And it's just like you can see how those sorts of things start to steamroll. And he's 17 freaking years old.
He might get homesick.
Yeah, I mean, when you're 17 years old, when I was 17 years old, I'm 41. I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up, man. So when you're 17, like, and you're making a decision, like all of a sudden some guy you're friends with says, hey, why don't we come here and team up? You go, well, that sounds kind of good. And then, Brian Hartline gives you a phone call and you're like, yeah, do you guys have a DJ Lagway coming in? And well, it's Ohio State. So they'd say, yeah, we got 4 of them lined up. But, but there's just so much stuff that can happen. And I don't understand. This is the thing. Like, a lot of people will get upset when I'm like, look, 13th, 14th, 15th, and recruiting isn't good enough. And the reason it's not good enough is there's 6 SEC teams or 7 SEC teams that have just beaten you. Yeah. And it always flummoxes me when people are okay with that. So they're going, no, I want to beat them on the field. I want to beat them in recruiting. I want to beat them in academics. I want to beat them in swimming. I want to beat them in basketball. Like, I want to beat them at every sport they can because I want Florida to be the top tier university when it comes to everything, not just academics, not just football, not just anything like that. And recruiting is part of that. So I don't want to be a loser when it comes to that sort of stuff. 7th place sucks. It doesn't matter where you are. It's just bad. And so, I think you don't ever get to number 2 or number 3 in the country without asking the top recruits to come. That's the one place that Billy Napier just hasn't been able to close the deal yet, whether it was Harold Perkins or whether it was last year with Okunlola and then the stuff that went on with Rashada. Like, he has not closed the deal with those elite guys yet. He's got Lagway in 2024, but if you could get Lagway and Jeremiah Smith, it's interesting. I was looking back the other day at Urban Meyer's bump class. Just about all of the all SEC guys that came out of that 2006 class for his bump class were Spikes, Tebow, and Harvin. Like it was like, I think there were like 14 all SEC seasons that came out of there. There were a couple for Jermaine Cunningham. There was 1 or 2 for Brandon James as a special teamer, but then everything else was basically Harvin, Tebow, and Spikes. And so you bring in a class with Harvin, Tebow, and Spikes, and look, Lagway and Smith, you're getting pretty close. And you got linebackers coming in who are pretty good too. I think there's an opportunity there to sort of put together that core. And when you have an opportunity to do it, you got to take the swing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, well, big IMG group visit this past weekend here for the Gators, and of course, you got Najee Harris last cycle from IMG, but seeing time as a true freshman this spring for the Gators along the offensive line. But another offensive lineman from IMG, Jordan Seaton, 6'5" offensive tackle. Of course, that's a position the Gators really need to hit. Some elite talent, some top talent at the offensive tackle position. He's a top 50 offensive lineman overall. Would be a future left tackle for the Gators. Maybe start out as a guard, but could play some left tackle for the Gators. Merger programs, Ohio State, Bama involved there as well. Florida's best shot, I think, at this moment of getting a top target from the high school ranks as far as the tackle goes. Did well in the interior last cycle, did the Gators with Harris and Kearney, but need to hit better along the offensive tackle spot there for the Gators. Defensive lineman, David Stone. He's a 5-star defensive lineman that may be hard to pull away from the Midwest, Oklahoma or Texas A&M. He's an Oklahoma native, but did say a conversation with Coach Napier is one of the best conversations he's ever had with a head coach. I think there's interest there in Florida, so we'll see if Florida can keep chipping away at this one as he looks to set up a visit the first week of June. Some ground to make up there, but one visit here helped, and hopefully the official goes another step. We'll talk tight end Jonathan Eccles in just a second, Will, but talking trench talk here from IMG here with Jordan Seaton and defensive lineman David Stone.
Yeah, well, I mean, so Seaton obviously is a top 60 recruit overall in the 24/7 composite. There aren't a lot of those guys in the state of Florida. Now, look, he's from DC and then he's at IMG, so he's not really a Florida guy. But you've got a guy who's in that circle, who's close to you, and is going to have connections. And other guys, look, I mean, the big deal with Kamari Wilson coming was not necessarily that it was just Kamari Wilson. It was that now you have a pipeline. You have somebody to tell you what it's like to play for Billy Napier. And, you're not wondering, is the coach just pulling wool over your eyes when he's talking to you? Is it actually a unique relationship? Is it, is he genuine? Those sorts of things. You can get those sorts of answers. Not the pipeline's opened up. Same thing with Najee Harris. So guys like Seaton and Stone, these are guys who are going to have that information. Now, I'm less concerned about the defensive line than I am about the offensive line at this point. They brought in some good transfers through the portal, but transfers are just sort of putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. And for a year or two, you can paper it over, and eventually you're gonna pay the piper if you don't have offensive linemen. Florida, for some reason, just does not produce high quality offensive linemen the same way that some other states do, which means it's more difficult for the Gators to bring in those high level talent offensive line guys, or you got to find sort of diamonds in the rough. The Pounceys, I think, were rated in like the 250 to 350 range. We're able to bring those guys in, and obviously, they were very successful at Florida and in the NFL. So Seaton is the guy I look at and say these are the guys they have to hit on, not necessarily just because of the overall ranking, but because of the dearth of offensive linemen in the state, typically in the state of Florida, where you can go out and get talented guys at the receiver position, or even on the defensive line, or even at linebacker. But when it comes to offensive line, there just haven't been a lot of those guys in the state of Florida. And so that means it's resource heavy. You got to go outside of the state to bring those guys in, and it's a little bit more difficult to bring them into a program. Now, look, I think, Osiris Torrance and Mazuka, if he succeeds, and some of the other guys that they brought in, if they turn into NFL quality players, well, now you got something to sell. And so I think they'll be able to sell the 2 offensive line coaches and look at all the guys we're putting in the NFL and that sort of stuff. But as of right now, it's still a little bit dicey, especially considering some of the folks they're competing against. So look, Seaton's a guy who has offers from Alabama, And whenever Alabama wants an offensive lineman, that's somebody that you want too. And so, I look at it and say, yeah, let's go win that battle. Same thing, man. Like, do we not want him to be on a official visit
Right.
because he might go to Alabama? Is that where we are now? We're just going to roll over and give up. Bring this guy in, man. Top 50 IMG. You got a guy in the state. Or sort of in the state. You got to make sure you keep him there.
All right, well, let's go to tight end position because this one might be clearing up a little bit as far as targets go. We'll stay at IMG right now. Tight end Jonathan Eccles, he's a Tennessee commit right now. Top 100 athlete, but wants to play tight end in college. That is the position he's playing now at IMG. He's open to listening to others, even though he's committed to the Vols. Needs to get to know Russ Callaway better, of course, the new tight end coach there for the Gators. But look, that's it from IMG. These three guys, Jonathan Eccles right here at tight end. But we'll stick with tight end in this position group for a couple more targets. Of course, the big one, Walter Matthews, has Florida in his top 2. He announced along with USC. So Florida and USC battle right now for Walter Matthews, 4-star tight end from Georgia. Visited this past weekend. Florida has been in good shape with this one. Some wonder how the coaching change with Russ Callaway taking over would change things, but he came away impressed with meeting with Callaway and how Florida would use him. Another first week of June visitor for Florida with Lagway, Jeremiah Smith on campus as well. A decision coming from the fall, likely in the fall there, but hopefully Florida just blows that visit out of the way, gets their tight end in the fold, probably Walter Matthews. Some really good feelings to go along with that one too. But and then also Corey Bender from On3 reporting that 4-star. He's a 4-star on 3. He's a 3-star on 24/7. But tight end Eric Gardner in play as well. Former Purdue commit from Illinois, 6'5", 220. Set up a visit for June the 9th. Other offers from Alabama, Auburn, A&M, Michigan State, Iowa, Arkansas, Louisville, Pittsburgh, among others. Thought Iowa, Michigan State, the Aggies, Bama, along with Florida, as the other schools mentioned, as maybe favorites right now. But those three, maybe we got some clarity on the tight end position right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think these are different guys. I mean, you got Matthews, who's 6'7", 245. You got Eccles, who's 6'4", 230. So those are different guys in terms of their overall size, skill. You look at Matthews and you start thinking Darnell Washington is what I think when I see those sorts of stats down, like you said, to Florida and USC. Look, that's a big-time battle considering Lincoln Riley out there in USC. It's not going to be easy, but you do have the home field advantage in that Hiram Georgia is a whole lot closer to Florida than it is to Los Angeles. And so, again, we talk about putting that circle around Gainesville, and maybe you're broadening a little bit to get out to Hiram, but it's a whole lot closer than Los Angeles. So that's one that you hope Florida can win. Eccles, again, you're going to have to flip him from Tennessee. That's a hard one just because the Vols and the Gators hate each other so much. So you are sort of opening yourself up to criticism. I think sometimes that sort of stops it. Like if you're a Tennessee commit and you go to like Ole Miss or you go to Mississippi State or something like that, they're like, all right, whatever. But if you go from Tennessee to Florida or Tennessee to Alabama, I think at that point people start to look at it and say, all right, what are you really doing here? But again, Eccles, the guy who's got Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, Cincinnati, and Florida on his list. So high quality tight ends, and we know they need it, right? I mean, basically you got Jonathan Odom who's hurt, you got Keon Zipper who's hurt, you got Dante Zanders who was underwhelming last year during the regular season. Then you got a bunch of young guys who haven't really played. And so these are also young guys who haven't really played yet, but you're going to have to hit on some of them. And so I would not be surprised if they take multiple tight ends. And like I said, these guys have different profiles in terms of their size, which means that, in a lot of the 2 tight end sets that Billy Napier's going to run, you'll be able to get both of them out on the field at the same time if that's really what you want to do. And so these guys will get plenty of playing time if they decide to come. And I think that's one of the big selling points that Napier's going to be making.
Well, let's get into one of the bigger news items of this Monday here. And Jordan Pride, and as we've been on this episode, is now announcing that he's going to commit tomorrow. And earlier today, he has been crystal balled to Texas A&M. First by Steve Wiltfong from 24/7, and then some picks of other 24, Blake Alderman from Swamp 24/7, put in a pick for Pride to A&M, and also, a lot of on-3 picks as well now for Jordan Pride and going to the Aggies. So decommitted, of course, from Florida State a few weeks ago. Florida was thought to be the next landing spot for the safety Jordan Pride. A&M's always been in the mix, but a visit there this past weekend may have swung things in this recruitment in favor of the Aggies. Florida has recruited him. They like his versatility. There are concerns. Will did confirm that there are concerns with the knee injury. So the priority may not be as high, but I believe from everything I've been told would still be a take at the same time with Florida, but would not be too caught up in emotion if he goes somewhere else. Phil Simi already in the fold, Josiah Davis already committed as well. And there's other options on the board for the Gators too. Xavier Mincy, 131st player overall from Daytona, can play both safety and cornerback. He's an option at both spots, and the staff will still try and continue to flip Jalen Hayward, 42nd overall player from Georgia, safety committed to the Dogs right now. So Florida, still some other options out there for the Gators, but Jordan probably making his announcement on Tuesday. And with the recent trends or anything, looks like Texas A&M will be the pick and not Florida.
Well, if Cormani McLean taught me anything, it's that recent trends usually don't mean much of anything, because I already had my "Welcome to the Gators" article written, and all of a sudden he was going to Miami. So, and then wound up not going to Miami as well. But the interesting thing is, if you go to 24/7, Andrew Ivins has pride and his main comparison is Trey Dean.
Yeah.
And so, you look at that and you go, I'm not sure Gators fans were going to get all excited about a guy who's comparing a safety to Trey Dean, given what we saw last year. And look, I joke a little bit. I think Dean contributed a lot to the organization, but obviously was not a difference maker. And I think that's the question with these guys. He's ranked 84th nationally. Those aren't can't miss prospects, but they're very good prospects, and you need to chain those guys together. So I'd love to have pride in the class, but like you mentioned, they already have a couple of safeties in the class already. And that's an area they're going to hit pretty hard just because they got a lot of youth there, right? I mean, they're starting 2 sophomore safeties this year. Unless they bring in more guys through the transfer portal, it's going to be Kamari Wilson, Miguel Mitchell. And, those guys I think are going to have some bumps in the road as we start the season, especially. And, we'll see how they grow into that role, but they're going to need more and more talent at that position. Look, it's become like – defense has become nickel and dime packages, and so you need versatile guys at safety, and Pride is one of those guys. And so if you have an opportunity to bring him in, even if you got some concerns about a knee injury, you do it. And honestly, the way the transfer portal works these days, unless somebody has to take a medical red shirt because of an injury, like if they just aren't performing because of an injury and they transfer someplace else, it doesn't really hurt you that much in terms of the overall numbers. And so I do think that taking a guy who might be an injury risk but has that sort of versatility at a position of need and a position that is just needed throughout college football is something that Florida would be wise to do.
All right. And a couple more items in recruiting before we sign off here. Hosted Houston transfer running back Alton McCaskill, on one of the top skill players in the portal. Winner of the AAC Rookie of the Year in 2021 season. Rushed for 961 yards, 5.1 yard average per attempt, 16 touchdowns in 14 contests. McCaskill also recorded 21 receptions for 113 yards and 2 scores. Tore his ACL last spring about a year ago, so he didn't get to build on that performance. 3 years left. And I did see a whole lot, Will, over social media and Gators Breakdown Plus Discord. Why running back? Why running back are we targeting in the transfer portal this year? Florida stacked that running back. Look, this is a future move for Florida. We don't know what the future holds for the running back spot. Montrell Johnson could go to the NFL draft. Cam Carroll, only 1 year at Florida as well. So, it leaves you with ETN, Webb, and, of course, some commits that Florida has. But, this would give you, if he ended up committing to Florida, some depth for, this is not a 2023 season move. This is more of a down the road guy who's already proven at a level here at AAC, was the best freshman running back in the AAC that year at Houston. Houston is not some small program out there in the AAC. So you impressed there at Houston with Dana Holgerson. I think you can do some good things there at Florida. Well, Florida brought him on campus this past weekend. No issue with it. And look, I know there's other needs in the portal, but this is a future move, not an immediate move for 2023. If you have the room, if you're hopefully, and I'm sure the staff is doing it the right way of not forcing other positions out just to bring McCaskill in. But if you got the room for him, he wants to come to Florida, I see no issue with it. He was a 406th overall player in the 2021 class, 27th running back, produced as a true freshman at Houston.
Let me ask you, what position did we see on Florida last year where we went, wow, we don't need anybody else there? Like, we don't criticize Georgia. You look at Georgia and the quarterback competition they have this year. It's two 5-stars and a 4-star, and you're sitting there going, "How are those guys in there?" You look at Ole Miss bringing in like 3 transfers this year, all at the same position, and go, "What do they do? Like, why would those guys go there?" And you just look at it, you go, the schools that do well are the ones that stockpile talent everywhere. And so don't let scholarships go to waste. Don't play with 82 or 83 scholarship players because you didn't want to bring in some guy for need. Bring in the best players you can bring in and then let the chips fall where they may. And if McCaskill beats out Johnson and ETN, then you're better than you were. And if he doesn't beat out Johnson and ETN, then he can transfer someplace else at the end of the year or he can take over when those guys leave. But the idea that you'd want to avoid competition, that you wouldn't want to bring people in when there's no penalty for doing it, I think is the thing that you got to look at. So in the past, when you had limits in the number of counters that you could have with transfers, where you brought in a transfer and that meant you couldn't bring in a high school kid, that made a huge difference. And so Florida had signed 28 and 29 guys in the last two high school cycles. Well, now bringing in a guy like McCaskill would have a negative impact because you would be limiting what you could do in the next recruiting class by bringing him in because of scholarships and also because of the counter system and the way that works. They don't have that problem right now. They're not at 85 scholarships. They signed, I think, 19 guys 2 years ago and 20 this year. And so, you're allowed to sign extra guys for guys who go out the transfer portal. And there have been plenty of guys who transferred out. So Florida, from a numbers perspective, doesn't have a crunch. And so if you've got a guy who's skilled, who plays a position, even if the position is stacked, you bring him in because you have the numbers to do so. So unless it means they're not bringing in a tight end or a quarterback, I don't really have an issue with it. And look, they still got the space to bring in those guys too. So McCaskill's put up some stats when he's had the opportunity. Certainly, I think, you'd look at the medicals of somebody who's had knee injuries like that at the running back position, but an ACL injury is just a year injury at this point. It's not career ending. It's not career threatening. Guys get back to what they were pretty quickly. And, more competition anywhere on this team is a good thing. Like compete, have guys to replace the guys who are not performing. That's how you're going to get better.
All right, Will, I had to do a full episode on it, and of course, the Gators get their first wide receiver commit last Friday. Isaiah Williams, 4-star on the 24/7 Sports Composite and the On3 industry rankings, 325 overall, 48th wide receiver on 24/7, 297th overall on On3, and the 50th wide receiver. Speedster there for the Gators at the wide receiver spot. Honestly, you sit here, 6 foot. 172 pounds. I remember, and I put it in that episode, the running joke of Billy Gonzalez. Oh, he only wants the big, slow, prodding, go up and get him type of receivers. Well, his first receiver recruit back under Billy Napier, 6 foot, 172, and a guy that can run.
Yeah, Williams is underrated. I think you're going to see him fly up the recruiting boards pretty soon. Last year, he only caught 6 passes because of injuries. He caught 34 the year before as a sophomore. So this year, he's going to have an opportunity to show what he can do. If he can stay healthy, I think you're going to see a lot of people who they're putting him at a 4-star, 325 for the 24/7 or 297 for On3, like you've got on your graphic here. The reason he's there is because he hasn't been able to stay healthy and because the skills that he's shown at camps and other things like that have not necessarily translated over to the field yet. Now, I mean, that could be a glasses half full or glasses half empty thing, right? It's like, oh, okay, this is somebody who can't stay healthy. That's going to be a problem. Or it's somebody who's undervalued.
And it was a collarbone, so more than likely a freak injury, but still.
Well, but again, I mean, it's glasses half empty, glasses half full. I can understand why you look at it, which is why he's sitting in a range where people go, this is a blue chip recruit, but not a can't miss recruit. I don't know whether he's going to rise up to can't miss recruit by the time the season's over, but if he can stay healthy, I think you're going to see him jump up into that 100, 125 range by the time things are over. When you look at his tape, you can see the speed, you can see the separation. And again, this goes back to just everything about keeping guys in the state of Florida, and Williams continues that trend. And you think about the 3 guys you brought in last year, and you've managed to have somebody else come in on the back end who's a blue chip recruit. You got to start stacking these guys, right? I don't know necessarily that Eugene Wilson and Mizell and Gene are all going to work out, but now you add Isaiah Williams, and you're going to add another, hopefully 2 wide receiver recruits this cycle. And if you end up with a guy who's ranked like 50th, a guy who's 100th, and a guy who's 300th, well, now you've stacked two solid wide receiver recruiting classes back to back, and nobody's going to be talking about on a CBS game where Florida doesn't have the ability to generate separation at wide receiver. So Williams is a part of that, right? And they clearly are putting an emphasis on speed when it comes to this. They are finding guys who run track and bringing those guys in. And, look, that's the way Urban Meyer won. He got speed out in space. And Napier has a little bit different approach on offense. But, look, offense for football is the same no matter where you go. Get your speed out in space and let them take it out. Short throw, high completion percentage, and let the receiver do the work. And, Williams is a guy who hopefully will be able to contribute to that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned stacking talent there. TJ Moore, I think you start feeling good about him too at the wide receiver position. 179th overall, a top 25 wide receiver, 29th in the state of Florida. So, I mean, you're looking at a top 20, top 25 receiver. I mean, 24/7 Sports own rankings has him as a 126 overall. So, as you're saying, the three guys you brought in last, two Tampa area guys, one you got committed here with Isaiah Smith, hopefully TJ Moore up next. I mean, you really are turning this room around.
Well, and Flip Smith, and all of a sudden things look really different, right? So, I mean, look, there's an opportunity here and this has been one of the things that's really been encouraging, is there's an opportunity for this 2024 recruiting class to be top 2, top 3, somewhere in that range. Last year, you were warning me about this time of year. I don't think it's going to happen, Will. I think we're going to sit there at like 8 or 9. It turned out it was worse than that. And we probably would have wound up 8 or 9 if Rashada had ended up in the class. So it wound up right around where you were thinking it was going to be. And I'm sitting there going, oh, really? Like, we brought him in to fix this, and it hasn't been fixed yet. But it looks like it's starting to turn around. And so, look, you got to deliver. You got to bring these guys in. But that's why we just had a 10-minute rant on why you bring in Jeremiah Smith, because you got to turn it around. And Smith makes, like, it was the same thing on offensive line this year. The offensive line class for Florida was actually pretty good for the 2023 class. The problem is it didn't have that anchor. And if you had Okunlola in there with everyone else that they brought in, with Najee Harris, with Kearney, and all of a sudden you look at the offensive line through that lens, because you have Okunlola, everything looks awesome. So it's sort of the same thing here. Like, Williams is going to be a very good player. I think he's going to be a contributor. He's certainly going to help the competition in the room. But you kind of have to grade this recruit through the lens of all the other recruits who come in through the class. And, again, Smith sort of changes the prism through which we're looking at everything if they can manage to flip him.
All right, there we go. Oh, that's a good episode. Glad to be back with you, Will.
Yeah, man. Well, it's funny because 2 weeks ago you gave me the week off and I completely forgot I was traveling for work. So it's like my wife reminded me I was out of town on like Saturday or something like that. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm traveling somewhere. It's been that kind of summer, man, or that kind of spring with all the stuff going on. So yeah, it's been a couple of weeks, but been buried trying to get this magazine done, man. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun, and it's also reinvigorated me for the season. I got to admit, I think, and we can feel this with the fan bases, there's not a lot of optimism for 2023. It sort of stinks going into the season knowing you're not going to be competing for the playoff. And, I don't think any of us have any illusions that Florida's going to be competing for the playoff. And so with that comes just sort of a malaise. And one of the cool parts has been, as you dive into it, you go, well, there's a place they can improve. And is it reasonable? Yeah, it's reasonable. Okay, well, there's another place they can improve. Is it reasonable? And so I keep waiting for the announcement of what quarterback's coming in through the transfer portal, because if they can pull an elite quarterback through the transfer portal, it completely changes the tenor of everything. Because I think they're going to be a lot better in a lot of different places. And the question is, what's going to happen at quarterback, and can they offset it? Now, I think there's some cool stuff that Napier does on offense, and that's been one of the other cool parts, is looking through that. But I'm much more optimistic about the season now than I was after the Oregon State game, or after early signing day, or after national signing day, or after the spring game even. Like, you watch that spring game and went, oh, that was every nightmare I thought it might be on the offensive side of the ball. So there's certainly a lot of work to do, but like I said, as things start ramping up, and maybe this is just the eternal optimist in me as we get close to the season, but everybody knows that there is no eternal optimist in me. So if I'm saying that I think there's some underlying reasons to be hopeful, I actually do believe it, and I'm starting to get excited about things.
There we go. And Will and I, we were messaging back and forth over the weekend, and I was letting him know, our topics for the night. And I said, look, eventually I do want to do an episode, reasons for optimism heading into this season. So you hear Will, he's got some things on his mind. I got some things on my mind. We will do somewhat glass half full, because look, I know, like Will said, I know there's probably some malaise out there. not many people looking forward to maybe the outcomes. Look, I know we're all looking forward to football, but maybe the outcome, not necessarily. But I think we'll take a look at maybe some reasons to feel good about this team, and maybe those good things all turn out. And Florida has this big surprising season, but I do think, as Will said, there are some things to look forward to as reasons for optimism. We'll get into that sometime soon here on Gators Breakdown.
Yeah, man. Look, I mean, hope is one of the things that Napier
We're all
has
fans.
brought.
We're all fans.
Well, and the thing is that recruiting is trending up, which means the hope is trending up. The question is, how long do we have to wait for the hope? And that actually is one of the things I've been trying to preach in terms of recruiting is that, look, if you think that you can win playoff games, being the 15th ranked team in the country in recruiting, I think you're delusional. Unless you're in the Big Ten, or not the Big Ten, unless you're in the Pac-12 or the Big 12 or something like that, then you might be able to do it. But the problem with Dan Mullen is he was sitting there at 12th pretty much continuously, or 9th pretty much continuously. You weren't actually seeing progress. So the fact that we're seeing progress on that recruiting front makes me go, okay, there's one place where things are changing. So now I look at the defense. All right, we got a new defensive coordinator already. That was the complaint with Mullen, right? I mean, the dedication and the loyalty to Grantham that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay, well, there's another place you might see an improvement. And then you look at the offensive line and say, these guys there's a lot of turnover there, but these guys have a reputation for bringing guys along, and they identified these guys in the portal. So let's see. So I think there's a lot of things that you look at and say, things could be better if they roll right. There's a lot of things where you get a couple injuries and you go, uh-oh. But, I think that's the way it is every season, unless you're Georgia or Alabama or somebody like that. And look, there's a lot of questions at Alabama. I mean, they just brought in a guy through the transfer portal at quarterback because they didn't like their two options during the spring game. Obviously with Bryce Young leaving, you got Stetson Bennett leaving at Georgia. There's been a lot of turnover this year in the SEC, and there's always teams that surprise you. So, I'm not saying Florida's going to win the playoff, but honestly, I'd take 5-7 if there was a win over Georgia. So, it also depends on what the expectations are, man. You just got to – there's always that. Like, there is hope that we can beat Georgia until that game is over. And so hold on to that, and it'll be a fun season.
All right, there we go. Yeah, we'll get to that episode sometime soon. I know we're here May. Preseason magazine to be out sometime in the next month or so. So we'll do our annual recap of those things and all that coming up. But recruiting will definitely be hot and heavy over the next month. All these visits coming up. Beginning of June, first couple of weeks of June. So, of course, we'll have you covered right here on Gators Breakdown. So, all right, that'll do it for this episode. For Will, I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of Gators Breakdown.